I just got a whole bunch of interesting sort of things that I just picked up this morning. This is all within the last week. So things are happening in the AR and VR world. It's been around for a while, but it's never quite reached that level of, are we, it's not mainstream yet. I don't know if you've all seen the ads over for Black Friday or Cyber Monday, but Oculus Go was down to $179 and they've got a commercial out. They're trying to sort of, this is the year that it's going to be mainstream. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I just have to. But why are you here and what are the thoughts that you have about, are there any questions that you'd like to have answered? We'll put these on the board and then as we go around the room and have our conversations, if any of our contributors or anybody has ideas towards these, we can look at them. Anybody like to start who you are and any main thoughts or questions that you have?
Yes, Craig Cook. I'm from the library's technology operations, but I'm curious about who has integrated kind of VR or AR into their classrooms, in what sense, and if not, what have been the barriers?
All right, any classroom examples, and that's actually a big one as well. I don't know if there are any. And let's just go around, can we, Lauren?
Sure. I'm Lauren Rosen, and I work with.
Me?
Yes, I'm me today. I might be somebody else tomorrow. I come for just the cookies and coffee. Now, I've done a lot with Google Cardboard, and my interest is mostly, as working with language teachers, is being able to bring other places to them as opposed to recreating current places in, or, what was the one where people flew around and
Second Life?
yeah, I just looked at that and I was like, I want my students talking to real people and seeing real places, not virtual fake ones. So I'm kind of coming at it from that angle.
All right, I saw three things here. The Google Cardboard, I'm assuming because it was accessible and it was cheap.
Exactly.
Creating existing content instead of content creation, so we can talk about creation versus creation. And then authentic, which would be sort of an interesting one. Okay. Jeff?
My name's Jeff. I'm from the Department of French and Italian. I heard a rumor that Harvard is using this in their French 101, 102 classes as a part of, I guess, a main curriculum element. So I was kind of, I thought it was kind of wild, so it's fun here.
Can somebody Google that?
Sure.
Angela?
Angela from biomolecular chemistry, which is physical medicine.
Yeah.
I think it's fun.
And I just haven't been in a long time, and this seemed like an interesting topic. So I thought I'd come by, and seeing some of the medical applications is pretty interesting. So just here to learn.
All right. Carl?
My name's Carl. I'm over in the College of Engineering. I'm the shop manager for the
Nicole.
makerspace with the Granger Engineering Design Innovation Lab. We also oversee the Color Visualization Studio on the first floor, which has VR equipment in there that students can check out, as well as a large touch screen, and like the HoloLens can also be checked out from our space. My background's more in physicalized objects, so the virtual side is new. But I've run into some classes that have come over and used the tech. So they are around.
All right. So student and creation, say student creation. Yes,
I don't have any specific questions, but we oversee a space that has this equipment.
Where is this again?
The Went Cummins,
Okay.
the Color Visualization Studio is on the first floor, and the makerspace hall on the second floor. Which is confusing because the basement level is the first floor. Think garden apartment.
Oh, okay.
Caroline?
Yep, I'm Caroline Daughtry-Krill, and I am an instructional designer here at Academic Technology. And I work behind the scenes right now on the undergrad anatomy courses. And for the lab, we've just been thinking more about what can we have to give the students more of the hands-on experience, but in digital ways that maybe they could do outside of the lab because their time in the lab is pretty limited. And also what can we do in the lab to mix things up with the different stations they go through as they're learning.
All right, that sort of fits into the authentic,
Yeah.
while not quite as authentic as it's, or expensive as a box.
And also thinking about what's already existing, because it seems like out of scope for us to be building our own, something from scratch.
James?
I'm James Lycides. I direct the video management service for UW-Madison. But all my graduate work was in how ideology is recreated in video games in virtual worlds, and that led into directing online education and such. But I did some work with Gear Learning, talking about writing articles about how education and educational theory can connect with video games and the outcomes there. When I taught, I did a lot of work around the concept of games and using that as a methodology.
Okay.
I think what I've heard recently and around the country when I travel is that video game or virtual reality is sort of the dying version of it because they don't have the 2 million user base that they need in 2 years or whatnot. But augmented reality is a possible thing. In my last job, I used augmented reality like Erasmus for the admissions team when they would go to different places. You know, you could scan a picture of our campus logo and it'd pull up an intro video or something gimmicky like that. But it was pretty cool and actually worked to attract people.
All right, I'm gonna use that word gimmicky as well. And AJ?
Mostly I'm here to learn. I don't know much about this. I always like active teaching labs though. There is one cool thing recently that I'm not going to be able to say the specifics at the moment because I can't remember. But there's a company in town that's developing something with augmented reality where they're trying to be the first ones to break through like persistence of objects in a virtual space. So like you put something there and it stays there and you can like touch it kind of.
Virtually?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's just something interesting. I don't know.
Ryan?
Ryan Martinez, I'm an instructional designer for the University of Wisconsin System. I don't know if I have any particular questions. I was one of the signed up contributors.
Yay.
I could probably speak to some of the uses of VR in like classrooms on like smaller scale. I did a presentation at the ELI conference in New Orleans where I actually shipped my entire Oculus Rift and computer along with Google Cardboard headsets to kind of talk about the feasibility of this. And then sort of like directions of VR.
Wanna put that down as portability
Yeah, there is none.
and cost?
There's a lot right
Good. David?
A little up and down arrows. I'm David Gagnon, and I'm with the Wisconsin Center for Education Research, and I'm a researcher there, and I run a group called Field Day Lab. And at this point, I'd say about 50% of our funding, maybe more, is coming from usually NSF-related work, researching VR, AR for learning in different ways. So some of the key questions I have right now are, how can community-created augmented reality experiences in rural environments help different stakeholders within that community understand the complexities of how they come together? So school principals and business owners and governors using AR as a way to make meaning about the complex relationships between their domains. So that's a project that we are kicking off right now, just got funded on that. Another one is around augmented reality as an authoring platform for helping develop science communication identities in young women. So how do we have young women who identify as arts orienting not have to enter into the field of science as chemists or biologists, but as science communicators using new interactive media? So that's I think we're near 2 of that NSF funded project right now and taking on our second cohort. Another project that we have with the Levine Museum of the New South is how can augmented reality environments in museums lead to adoption of a new narrative, specifically in relation to race and social justice issues. So that's, AR in a space. And then on the VR side, I have a proposal in right now, hopefully get funded around, are there instruments that we can create that allow us to understand personality types in VR and the kinds of VR experiences that someone would be attracted to and enjoy? And see how we can develop a new kind of demographic for the kinds of VR experiences people enjoy the most using non-VR based instruments, so particular surveys.
Alright.
Yeah, I think those are some of the questions.
Kevin.
So I'm Kevin Ponto. I generally teach the course on campus called Virtual Reality. This semester I got a reprieve because my wife and I just had our first son. So I have a staff member and one of my grad students teaching it. So I can talk in some to the difficulties of how do you teach a course like this. In terms of my research, it's a little bit less directed toward education goals, but just to put a broad umbrella around it, it really is geared toward recreating real life environments in virtual reality. And so we've done this for studying health in the homes, but we also work with the sheriff's office. We do this for crime scene investigations. We do this for historic preservation, working with the Park Service on shipwrecks. So it's kind of a little bit of a different spin and has lots of really tricky technical difficulties to get through because we all kind of know what the real world should look like. And so whenever anything doesn't look correct, your eyes immediately latch onto that. So those have been some of the challenges we've been facing with. But I've also worked with David some in the past on a very small project in which we've also done some informal learning using VR as one of our mediums.
All right, so with this in mind, let's start off with sort of the low. Where were we? Where did we come from as far as VR? What I think that it first started to catch people's attention with Google Cardboard because it was so cheap and not great, but it was something that people could start saying, this is, wow, what is this? I've never had my headphone in, or my phone on my head before, other than this way, but never this way. And Lauren, you said you've done some things with that in the past. And was it easy, fun?
So there's several apps out there that already exist that can help, at least in a language environment. One of the newest things that I started playing with, it would allow students to record their own and then be viewed by others. The question is the prize worth the price? Do you get that much more out of a 3D visual than because pretty much all of the apps that I've used with your phone, you can choose to view it in the cardboard and there's a 3D version of it, or you can choose not to if you don't have a class set of cardboard or whatever. And then you're just viewing the 2D version of the same place and walking through it. There are some advantages, but I don't know.
And I suppose for different things. So language learning might not be one that shows a lot of advantages, but a crime scene might be one that would be like.
Or if you're investigating the human body, I can totally see where 3D imaging
is. A heart or a shipwreck or.
Well, I would almost argue, and I don't have a background in this, but I would almost argue that learning language in VR would be almost better. Like for several students, like students that might have a lot of performance anxiety. Let's say if there's somebody in front of me speaking Spanish, I'm trying to speak back to them, and they're staring at me, and I can't really know how to respond. And there's a lot of anxiety there. But in VR, there's sort of that space that there's a barrier there, so that if there is a virtual avatar there and they're speaking to you in Spanish, and I don't necessarily know, I may not feel as embarrassed to do it, and I may be more willing to actually try to speak to that person. Just as a really side example, I have a good friend of mine who, there's a program called VR Chat, where you can use various VR headsets and you can go into different types of virtual worlds. And he actually created one, so he's actually kind of very popular there. And one of the friends that he has is basically mute by choice, does not talk, so that they basically just talk, actually using the keyboard in the VR space, and actually it comes up as a text box. But it allows that person to feel comfortable because they're in a place where they don't have to feel like they're too different because they're doing it in this manner. So in that case, I think it would be interesting because it kind of breaks down that barrier that maybe introverts may not be able to break down in the actual physical space.
And then there's the other element of that is the immersion, right? There are more senses at play, even visually, it's a richer environment than just seeing it on a screen.
Right.
Because so you feel like you're more,
It's kind of what you do with it that's going to make the difference, I think.
yeah.
Walmart right now is experimenting with a lot of training for their staff using VR. And the thing you mentioned, they leverage VR for practicing difficult conversations with customers, and they programmed an avatar to basically react to what somebody is saying. I'm sure it's not automatic. I'm sure it's controlled by whoever's running the program, but that is something that they have been experimenting with. I've heard about.
I know they do that with kids on the spectrum too, autism, that kind of thing, because those people that have that difficulty don't catch cues from other people's conversations, and so from that perspective, I think it has a place. I've always struggled with
Yeah.
how is this better than real life, real people, or how can I leverage it to prepare students for real life, real people?
So in some ways, it is like that multiple means of, or universal design for learning, multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression, just as an online forum gives people a chance to respond if they might be too afraid to raise their hand in the class of 500. This adds those extra layers or barriers of protection.
It just needs to be cheap enough and easy enough so that the technology doesn't get in the way of the purpose of using it.
James?
Well, I wonder if there's a difference between like where you go out with your phone and you record a video and then you can put goggles on, you can look around like with Google Maps or something, versus putting on a Rift and going into a virtual world and engaging with them. Those are two different kinds of virtual reality.
Yep.
We're kind of mixing the two. And then also, I mean, I found, you put on those goggles and you throw a virtual bone at a robot dog, and it's basically creating a real world experience, but in a shittier way. And that's always been my problem with it. Whereas like in a classroom, augmented reality is cool because it's reality with augmentation of like a dinosaur on your table. I mean, so creating an avatar of a person to interview is a shittier version of just interviewing an actual person. And is that the same as, is that a virtual reality? Is that a virtual world? Is that augmented? Or is that just a recording of a person? You could do the same with a video.
Agreed.
Well, it's not shittier if it works.
Yeah.
Does it work?
So
I mean, it doesn't. I mean, it's not taking.
Well, I was thinking of, there's some people who have done this for training teachers. And so the problem they have is if you have adults in the room, they try to act like kids. Fundamentally in your brain, you're like, those aren't kids. So then they basically have virtual representations that look like kids. Maybe people puppeteer them. And they found that to be much more effective than, because you couldn't have the kids basically do these actions. If you have the adults do it, then again, you're stuck with like, these are adults. So that might be one where that mix does make a little bit more sense.
I saw a presentation on something like that in Second Life. And they said that the biggest problem was everybody realized they could jump. So they were, flying and jumping all around the classroom, and it just obviously not realistic enough. It's that crappier version of reality.
I'll throw in an example, a classroom example on this. So I think 3 or 4 years ago now, there's a network of nursing schools in the state of Wisconsin. So pretty much everyone other than UW-Madison is in a cohort together. So there's 26 of these different schools, and they applied for a large Department of Labor grant because in nursing and medical education, generally simulation is a really big part of what happens.
And there's a rich heritage of simulation, and that just means they've really explored it. So one of the things that came up as a problem with the way they do simulation is that, you have like a mock emergency room with a rubber dummy on a table and let's say like a chart from the doctor and the little crash cart thing, or the cart thing with the medicines and stuff in it. And what they normally would do is have the instructors role play within that environment. And then the students, the nursing students would also be kind of role playing themselves. And there was a scalability issue that they ran into with that, because it ends up being that, you have 2 or 3 instructors full-time running simulations all day. And if you look at most nursing programs, apparently simulation now is like a significant part. It's like, 25 or 30% of time spent learning is like in simulation. So the project came up was, how could augmented reality in a really, really lightweight, really, really low fidelity mode, how could it possibly be a stand-in for the role-playing facilitators? So in this application, you hold up an iPad, and there are little codes around the room, and when you hold it over the patient's face, like in the rubber dummy's face, a video of an actual patient is there, and it becomes more of like an interactive narrative where, based on what they say or what they're complaining, you choose what to do and what to measure and what to prescribe and what to treat. And I think in the end, they spent about $4 million total over 4 years, but they developed 300 of these 5 to 10 minute long simulations that now mean if you have any room with a 6-foot table in it and you have access to a printer to print out a couple codes, that like 0 fidelity room can be 300 different nursing scenarios that run the entire curriculum. So you spend the money up front, and then it becomes this highly scalable, like highly effective form of doing, simulation-based work. So that ends up being like a nice kind of thing to hold out there a little bit and think like, okay, how do we really, when we are thinking about the cost of developing this relationship to scalability, you need a couple iPads, you need a printer, but the evaluations are coming back that these are as good as the regular simulations.
And the fidelity of that, it's low fidelity, and
Well, that's
once
video
it's
clips.
done, it's low cost, and presumably also, as you do it, and you have, hundreds of different people doing that, they're learning something that then can feed back into the next $4 million or whatever that they put into the next generation. Because the QR codes from the first one, like anything, and Carolyn, you know this, how to develop things like this. Well, this great scenario builder. Once you spend time building something, 3 years later, the technology changes and you have to move on to something else and do it over again. So to have those lessons learned during that 3 years or 5 years of use is helpful.
I think you pointed out something interesting there, which is the nursing, the traditional practice was on those rubber dummies, and those rubber dummies aren't people. People can't typically empathize with them, but once you can put a face on it and give it a narrative, that kind of allows you to be a little more empathetic. And I played a lot of video games, and despite the graphics, I found myself empathizing with just fictional characters who don't actually have human faces, and having difficulty still making decisions. Like, I want to do an evil playthrough, and then feeling bad about it and being like, well, I'm such a sap. Why do I feel bad about this? This is fake. But still being able to empathize with those characters despite the graphics, and it's hard to do that with a rubber dummy. But if you can attach a narrative to it, then you might be able to create more realistic situations that aren't totally realistic.
So is there a in the video games, you were dealing oftentimes probably with non-playing characters, right?
Yep.
The ones that were machine generated. And is there a difference in a machine generated character, or is a VR character, somebody that you're interacting with, who's actually a puppeteer of another person, an actual person? Can they add a level of realism or authenticity that, despite the crappy graphics, you actually have, like, oh, I'm just talking to Ryan, I'm talking to Dave, I'm talking to Lauren, even though in that fake world you're represented by something else? I mean, when we talk on the phone, especially the old phones, remember the call quality of this? It wasn't a real person that we were listening to, really digital stuff. It's digitally mediated. Are we getting close to digitally mediated virtual reality, as low fidelity as it is right now, just getting us closer to a higher fidelity human interaction?
Well, so I don't know if this is gonna answer your question. But to kind of lead off your talk about empathy, like in developing empathy for characters in games, one of the things that I've really been interested in is using VR spaces as a method of journalism. So, we think about if you're watching, let's say, the news, and you kind of like see like really short vignettes of something that happened that day. It could even be something as topical as the recent border disputes right now between Mexico and the United States. But if you get a 3D camera down there and you actually sit there and plant it, and somebody with a VR headset can actually look around and actually experience what's going on versus like newsreels like cutting things, I think that brings a much more impactful message that that we might not have had otherwise. And that's something that you could use a Gear VR headset, a Google Cardboard, an Oculus Rift, and then just a simple 360 camera. So I think in that respect, like these types of tools could be really good for developing empathy.
Is that what's happening with up north, David, with your community, the folks? I'm thinking of citizen science and citizen journalism, and
It's called STEM Ports, that project. I think it's a good thing for us to call out this difference between AR and VR, just really clearly.
Okay, yeah.
I think this is probably a good time. So I think when you are talking about that, like on the continuum, when we're designing or researching something, the key word that comes to mind with VR is immersion. So if we're looking for learning environments where immersion really matters, or some words I've learned from Kevin, which are immersion, but also this notion of presence. So like you are somewhere else. There are times when that really matters. So the thing that we built together, for example, exploring the universe, we wanted you to come face to face with a black hole. Having full control over what you hear, what you see, creates a very emotional, very large experience. And that was the learning goal. Like we wanted you to come face to face with a black hole and feel the wonder and awe of that, right? So immersion is VR, what comes to mind.
getting lost in a totally
Yeah, designer is in control. Like you are going along for the ride.
designer controlled
And
experience.
The other thing that comes to mind about VR and MR then, to get into like the HoloLens and mixed reality, is it's the most natural camera control that anyone's ever come up with. So when you're working with a 3D environment on a screen, camera control sucks. It takes a lot of skills to get used to how to move a camera within a 3D space. When you put a thing on your head, you're leveraging like embodiment, right? So it's like, it's really natural, like things to the right or to the right, things low or low. And so I think of that from a data viz standpoint, that MR and VR give that affordance. Augmented reality is way more of a wild card because it's everything from an augmentation that says that way's north, the thinnest possible augmentation you can imagine, all the way to like, there's other narratives happening in the space that we're in right now, and we're gonna make the paintings come alive, like the museum stuff we do. So that ends up being like this whole spectrum of use, everything from just like data to narrative augmentation to role play, and so it's just a bigger, wilder thing. So I think when we start talking about things like citizen journalism, the way that we've applied that has been, how do we add a very thin prompt within your physical, lived, social place that gets you seeing that place, perceiving that place, looking for things in that place, recording things in that place in a way that's slightly different than you would if we wouldn't have augmented it. So we're kind of experimenting with that whole project, which is how can we like add little prompts where the phone in your pocket kind of nudges you a little bit to take on a slightly different identity, to have a different goal, to notice things you wouldn't notice, so that the physical world is doing the majority of the work. And this is the stuff you and I have been talking about for a decade now. Versus VR, which is like, as designers, we come in heavy-handed. We're like, no, we are going to give you an experience, and we're in control. You get the camera, but we get everything else. And they're just really different kinds of environments.
And that the nudges that everyday folks can do because they have these things brings the portability and the cost way down, whereas the heavy-handed designer of the virtual realities, this still requires a lot of work and a lot of equipment.
This is kind of a tangent, but on your idea of like the journalism aspect of virtual reality, you think it's possible that over time, just like photojournalism, people become desensitized to violence and suffering when they are overexposed to it and they see it so often? The same could be said of virtual reality. We have the wow factor now when you put a stick in the ground of a Mexican territory battle, but we know that we're still removed from that and we just sort of get to experience it for a little while, but our perception is still of watching it, not fully experiencing it. And at some point, could it, just like they say about video games and violence, could it desensitize us to the real world?
That's a good question, because I've heard also that really good VR, you can almost get lost in. And so it is maybe the opposite, but is that a thing that we will eventually learn to filter out and just walk by? Or
In pursuit of that though, and I'll tell you about another project that we're working on. So also with Levi Museum, civil rights is the topic, and we wanted to have 4 moments in civil rights that through VR and a heavy-handed design, we like put you in the middle of these situations. So one of them is, for example, being at a counter of like a soda shop, and you're there and you're part of the protest group, and we get to control the room. So we do little puffs of air behind you. You're hearing people yell at you, and when you turn, and you're watching, like as you get hit from behind, you watch your vision kind of creep in with the
have you
red.
all been in one of these rooms in these museums? There's a great example in the Minnesota History Center, and I've seen several other ones before where you, in other places where it, the tornado hits and you can hear the walls shake. That's a very high-end, but really cool way to experience.
So it's like, does that really high-end experience desensitize you? It's like, man, I think, but the thing that we want people to do though is come out of that 10-minute experience and be like, I empathize with that moment in a way that I've never had an experience that deep with that moment if I watched it from the outside. Now, whether that desensitizes you in the long run maybe is a whole different question. I know that we're trying to approach it with, we want people to come away from that experience and feel like they understand it in a more experiential, embodied way than they did before.
But isn't that, I mean, when you see like Microsoft and the HoloLens with the military and that thing that just came out, and they're $500 million or whatever, and you see the research around PTSD and virtual reality, the whole goal is to desensitize you to a former stressful situation that caused that stress disorder.
Is that the goal, or is their goal to make you confront that situation?
Well, confront it repeatedly so that you desensitize from the shock of it.
But that's a very specific
It's very
application.
interesting.
But it has
I think it
arguments for
depends.
violence in general.
Sure, but I mean, this idea that it's gonna, it depends on what the motivation is. I think if you're setting up as this is gonna be something to help you empathize with the situation, hopefully that's what people will experience. If we're gonna keep doing this over and over until you're desensitized, absolutely, that will be the effect. And with violent video games, I mean, I think part of desensitization that comes from that is maybe a little dependent on the person's personality beforehand. Like, I've played plenty of violent video games.
Yeah, I'm not.
Is a lot of
When
this
an
just
animal
learning?
gets skinned, I'm like horrified.
Like the first time that you learn something, it's like, oh wow, and then you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. You're like, now I've become an expert at this. I was a novice; it was a big thing, and now I'm used to it. And I feel like that's part of both the desensitization and post-traumatic stress disorder, and also with the spectrum. And maybe there are other areas. I think there's something about what is the designer doing in it that can.
Does the Holocaust Museum desensitize you?
Well, you'd have to go back repeatedly
But it's also
to
the
But yeah,
experience.
if you
of the
expose yourself
situation.
constantly,
Like,
eventually you become
if
apathetic.
each of these experiences is a novel experience,
Right.
but if it's the same experience over and over, then yeah, you'll get, that's how neurons work. But
Groundhog Day, right?
I mean, I don't think that was the
Pull out
goal
of
of
that.
journalism ever, but we see that.
Side effects.
Yeah, it's just, I'm just playing. Yeah.
Well, no, I think it really, for a lot of interactive technologies, it just goes back to the context of its use. So it's, if I'm using it VR to, let's say, show a BBC News segment, that's gonna be a lot different than, and not to pick on low hanging fruit, but if I'm using my VR headset to watch an InfoWars segment, Like it's gonna be very different in much the way they're contextualized.
Sure.
The same thing with video games. If I'm playing America's Army just because I like team-based games versus if I'm playing it in an Army recruitment center. Like it's gonna be a very different use of it. Now, I do think it's important to think about with VR and AR, or at least with VR, and I'll speak for VR because AR, my experience is very little. You know, there is that whole idea of immersion. Like you put on the headset, you have the earphones, like even, you know, if you play like a horror VR game, you know that once you take it off that it's over, but it still scares the crap out of you while you're in it. So it's really about how we can kind of head things off at the past when developing these tools. And I think that's kind of as a side tangent, but you know, VR headsets used to be extraordinarily expensive, not only just the headset, but the computers in which to use them. And I think a lot of that was that they got a lot of first users to come in, and especially with Oculus, like, you know, make stuff, just make different things, and we're going to see what actually happens because they didn't even know what was going to happen with it. For me, it'll be really interesting when Oculus Quest comes out, because that's going to be a VR headset that's a standalone. You don't need a computer, you're not tethered anymore. And we'll see what's going to be done with that.
So this is,
Hey, Wiz, what you watching, man?
me. So you believe in that? Okay, so they're great example, right? You're holding this dope party about your pool, but you're not actually even there. You're isolated from it. Is that that helping us be more? Is this a pro-social thing, VR?
I mean,
This version, no.
it's already happening with mobile devices.
Right.
And I don't think you necessarily need to be immersed to detach from a social event. I mean, it happens already. People seclude themselves and detach from social events and immerse themselves in their own mobile devices.
Or the headphones or the.
Right.
I saw this really great photo the other day of a bunch of people waiting for a bus in the 1920s, and they're holding their newspapers.
Right, yeah.
And everyone's sitting shoulder to shoulder, not talking. And you're like, no, people are just
That's just
looking for their own
resources.
They can use whatever they can. Like, we only have so much capacity.
And then you say, what did I do in an elevator before I had a cell phone?
Look at your toes.
Yeah, right.
You found great detail in the room.
So the next elevators are just.
I was able to search through my notes. So the company is called Hollows. So they're hollows.io. Has anyone heard of them?
Yeah, they came out of their students, the former UW-Madison students.
Yeah. So they were in the MadWorks
Yep.
group, and they're the generator and stuff.
Yep.
So it's like an operating system. I think the way their logo looks.
Interesting.
That's kind of the HoloLens is too, where like my basement right now is still littered with the last grant that I wrote. So like every room has like different papers up on the walls. And then there's like
a virtual version of that.
Yeah, so it's just funny whenever you put it on, it's just like, oh, that was that last mode that I was in, right? Like spread virtual artifacts all around the basement.
The other,
I know that ARKit 2 from Apple offers persistence and shared experiences.
Yeah, HoloLens does a pretty good job.
The other thing I was thinking about as everyone was talking, like something I'm interested in, especially for kids, and obviously this can work for learning, is like physical representations of online content. So I started this thought process with a company called Cleek, and they make these little chips that you can put on a player. They don't actually do it anymore. They pivoted, but you put it on a player and then it loads online content. But I liked the idea of like the physicalness of the thing and what it loads could change. So I'm just thinking about like augmented reality and actually having physical things that, depending on the layer you're putting on it, mean different things, but you can actually pick it up and do stuff with it.
Something a little bit more meaningful than the QR code or the.
Exactly.
So I heard just somebody referring to what AR is kind of a really good, to differentiate it, they refer to it as painting the world with information. So while VR is very immersive, like a lot of the goals of AR, a lot of the examples you see is just painting the world with information. But one of the advantages to both VR and AR is you can leverage them to get a sense of scale, whether that's putting you in a group like a civil rights movement to get a sense. You can say there were 10,000 people at a demonstration, but I can't imagine being in a group of 10,000 people, but I could immerse myself in it. Or you can say that a T-Rex was, 100 feet tall, but like that doesn't give me that sense of scale. But if I could use my phone or put on a headset, that's really valuable.
I'll mention a researcher, Sadhna, and I always forget how to say her last name, but Puntam Bekar at WCR. She studies that exact thing, which is how do we look at augmented reality and augmented reality plus virtual reality plus physical objects. And specifically just finished like a 4-year NSF grant studying like the impact of those different kind of forms in media. And I know in her early findings, one of the really interesting things she's come up with is that the physical demos, at least in the stuff she's been studying, the physical demos when added to the augmented can actually distract from the learning that happened just from the augmented, which I think is kind of makes me a little frustrated because you don't want that to be the finding.
It just seems right or the threshold of like where it doesn't quite match up yet, so.
I don't know that.
Wait, can you explain that a little bit more?
So the really short version is that she had like a game, like a desktop-based physics game. And then she had an augmented reality-based version of that would play out in the room that you're in. And then she had a version of the augmented reality that also worked with a physical demo associated with it. And in at least one round of her study, she found that adding the physical demos had lower learning goals at the end, or learning outcomes at the end, than when it was just virtual or just augmented. So I'd be curious to hear, again, this is like anecdote, because she hasn't written this up yet, but she's in the middle of publishing on this right now. So I think it's interesting to know that there are people here right on campus that are right at the forefront of trying to understand those different modes and how they do influence learning.
So layering it on a physical object, layering augmentation on a physical object appeared to have like less of effect than layering like a virtual object in the space you're in.
Not like on screen. So a physics simulation on
okay.
actual
Right.
desktops,
Okay.
like and I mean virtual like all the way here on a, not this, but here versus the physical versus the two together versus augmented.
Speaking of learning, we've talked kind of about what's possible and some sort of expensive things. Kevin, you're teaching this class on virtual reality. You're starting to do things right now that you're running into the practical.
Yeah, and
roadblocks and stuff.
I'll say this has gotten way better since I started here. So I started here, I mean, this is pre-Oculus, so VR headsets cost $25,000, cave environments cost $1 million, so 1-200 really, have drastically changed this. But having said that, it still is a huge issue, I think, with students in terms of trying to teach these courses, because some students have their own equipment, most don't. A lot of the computing power that you need to drive these things, if you want to do it at a high-end level, is still pretty high, and students don't have that. So
They now go to the wrench, right?
well, and we actually have partnered in our teaching
Yeah, the
there.
class meeting, and
Yeah.
I actually have follow-up questions, but
Yeah.
I've had students that literally this morning asking for new software. It's all about content development. It's just that it's real kind of low-level modeling skills is a bottleneck.
Yeah, and
The philosophical question is having no one's getting to that because they have to make the environment.
right, and that's gotten better. So again, this is to me one of the big game changes that happened. Was it used to be a company came out with a device, and they would have what they call an SDK, which is here's how you use my device, and you as the developer were responsible for figuring out how to take your software, hook it onto that SDK to get to use with that device. And the big shift that happened, I don't know, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, is that companies said it is also our responsibility to make sure it works for a game engine. So we use Unity a lot, but there's also Unreal, there's some other ones. And so you buy a device, and if you've developed your code inside of Unity and Unreal, the pathway to get it to work for your device is much simpler. It's not quite as easy as checking a box.
Still not simple, but simpler.
But part of the problem we do have is that a lot of this content development falls between the cracks of this campus. right? It's not quite computer science. It's not quite art. It's not quite design.
I mean, you're in School of Human Ecology.
Right.
So-
Yeah. And so these are some of the issues I think. I've had students come up to me and say, I want to do grad school in developing new types of VR content, and I'm like, I don't know where to tell you to go. It's not computer science. It's not art. And so like these 3D modeling skills, a lot of these skills are still kind of either, like for our lab, it's like the students somehow learned it somewhere or took a class, or they just learn it on the job.
Or W. Stout is nailing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's nailing it?
Stout is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Stout is. If you want to learn how to model stuff in 3D.
Yeah,
Is
and then
that part of the industrial design program?
For the game design.
game design
So there's a
program.
game design program on its way here, or did I just hear that?
There's a certificate that was approved this year,
Okay.
but slow going. I mean, we're a big move, slow moving organization.
Yeah.
Stout was like, we're gonna nail this.
Yep.
Let's go. Hire
Yeah,
help.
they were down a little bit ago.
So again, it's we're on that journey towards mainstream, right? Or are we on a journey towards mainstream, or are we on a journey towards another specialized discipline?
3D is mainstream at this point, I think. I think it's safe to say that being able to develop 3D content is a pretty major part of what you would consider the media landscape. The same way film might have been,
All right, and that's the question. So I could be in an English course and they could say, create a video, multimedia presentation about da-da-da-da-da. Are we gonna get there with AR, VR?
Well, so and this also goes into, I think the discussion earlier, we're separating out like 360 video content from like a world that you can move around in, because those pipelines are so different right
Right.
now.
you can put a
That's the
360
3D
view
modeling
and go.
thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Buy one. You can buy one of those.
Yeah, exactly. So 360 video is,
Yeah, we circulate one of those cameras at college,
Yeah.
by the way, if anybody
Yeah, I
wants
was
to
gonna say,
borrow one.
We don't circulate it, but you can come and talk to me and check it out. We're getting a new one.
And we circulate an Oculus Rift 2 that you can take with you. But
And
we
there's a
also have
VR
station.
room there as well now?
Yeah, we have a station that we're trying to facilitate development. We've created documentation, so if people are interested in getting started, they don't have to have prior experience. They can sit down and
So college library, if you wanna check it out, and Went, if you want help.
So you can come and use the physical room. You can't take it with you and
Right.
have it in your dorm room.
Can you take a virtual copy of the room?
a virtual. But we also offer some of our student staff who we've hired who have just developed these skills on their own. One just sat down and did the Linda tutorials from front to back because he's that kind of guy.
Lynda.com.
yeah,
We do workshops or project support sessions that you can just look at our website and show up when those particular staff are there. But they also run into these cracks too, where people come in with lots of, the idea is really big, but all it needs is maybe a 360 camera and a way to map. That's sometimes it is, and they're talking about other things, but they don't. So there's also a vetting process, like what do you really need to get out of this?
right.
Which your staff can't handle, but they're around as much as they can, but I also don't have the skills to train them any more than what they've done by themselves.
So maybe that's the pathway for students or for people that are interested. Do you want to start off, just get a 360 camera, do very lightweight, you can start off with the Google Cardboard and Google Cardboard camera on your cell phone, start that, and go the next step to check out a 360 camera, use Sifter or Aris or some other type of program to design easy to use, accessible things to create something. If you're really into it, then you start doing the 3D modeling and creating whole spaces, but that's when the costs go and time and energy and expertise go.
That's sort of we kind of come out on campus too. It's like we're just a studio, that we can work with people for hire. And let's say like kind of the entry point is pretty much $100,000. It's like, it takes about $100,000 to do a project. Because it takes 6 people working 6+ months on a project full time. So that's what keeps our group busy all day long.
And I want to even say that at least Unreal is trying to develop a way to develop VR within VR. So you pull assets and place them around. You can even use something called A-frame where you can make small, kind of like not great looking 3D VR experiences, but you can do it using HTML. and then you can just use web VR. So I mean, I wouldn't say like, hey, Joe Shabadoo from this department, you can just sit down and make a VR experience right now in 3D, but they're definitely seeing that. I mean, that's why I think the equipment's getting cheaper, because they know that they need to keep lowering it so that more people get into it.
Almost like a Minecraft makerspace or something where somebody can make something and somebody else can go and be like, yes, I would like that. I remember geez, the pink toilet was, somebody in Second Life wanted the pink toilet, they created it, and now everybody's got a pink toilet. So yeah, having the assets created, and that cuts down the, what do I need to learn to know? I can just put this on and go virtual shopping for things and put them all throughout my basement or whatever. AJ?
I just thought of another question, because there's so many experts in the room. Is there anything in virtual reality or augmented reality where you can create something and bring it into the physical world? Like, yes, 3D printing, but like blueprints or, I don't know, does this kind of thing exist?
I mean, architectural visualization seems to be one of the biggest markets there. Like full walkthroughs of entire buildings.
Including like the plumbing lines, so that
Yeah, like
before
yeah.
they're not gonna go through each other or a wall or whatever.
That's probably the market that I'm aware of. The other one that has been kind of growing really rapidly because of LiDAR scanners and 3D cameras has been the real estate market. So that's kind of the other way around. Like you've got a physical place that you can experience at a distance, walk around the house instead of having to fly out to go see it.
Yep.
Those seem to be the immediate ones that come to mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if I'm allowed to say what company it was, but we had a local architecture studio. We were working with them, and they said 5 years ago they were using VR just to show their clients. They'd make up a mock-up, and they'd have their clients walk through. But today they also have their designers. They design something. So that's something that 10 years ago, Boeing, high-end design firms, automobile industry was using to try to catch design mistakes before they went into physical production. But what we've seen with this now kind of new round of consumer level VR is that's kind of dropped down so that smaller design firms can now do those same things.
Previs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Makes sense. I think what makes all this hard when we start talking about authoring, because obviously I've got a pretty big stake in the kids and learners making stuff, is that there's always that point in this meeting where I'll have a museum or a library say, okay, so we want to have a thing where a bunch of youth are going to create a bunch of content that then the public is going to use. And you're like, yeah, I've been doing this for about a decade and that never happens. Yeah. We tried, it doesn't happen. And there's all this cool stuff around learning how to make the media, but then the stuff that's actually consumer ready, I think these media are more complex. I mean, even use McLuhan, all media encapsulates the media before it. So something like a VR game encapsulates games, which encapsulates storytelling, UX, 3D lighting, modeling, animation, narrative construction, audio design, sound effects, visual effect. So you're okay, so to build a VR thing requires 35 skill sets. And it just does. Unlike when you're just audio recording, you're saying, well, how do we make a podcast? You're oh, there's still a million things you need to know, but a game uses all of those and then adds all these other ones on top. So I don't think there's some threshold I think we hit with media and complexity where you say, sure, there's certain kinds of video that you can make at home, but there's others that just require 400 people working on a project for 4 years. And you just need to know that they're video isn't video and VR isn't VR. And there's certain kinds of things, I saw a bunch of people 100 grand, holy crap. Within my world, I'm 100 grand is we are the little tiny guys on the block where everybody else is $10 million. And we're we can do it super cheap. And people don't believe how cheap we can do it. So it's just the scale and depth of these projects that we're
It's
talking about.
YouTube versus a blockbuster movie too, right? I can sit down and do something, but it's not gonna be the same as what I just spent $10.
And I think to piggyback on that, there's been, and this is something that's happened kind of back in the 90s even, there's some great papers that talk about people's expectations of what VR can do. People just expect you to be able to simulate everything we can do in the real world. And so the problem is not only is it all these other medias, but the expectations are oftentimes so much higher.
High production quality and all.
High production, they're used to playing video games with, 400 person dev team.
Right.
And now you have a a couple students or something else, and they say, why doesn't this look as good as that?
You're easily $100,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, they expect like virtual worlds to be open worlds, huge, enormous experiences, when so far what we've talked about are really linear, intentional small spaces, a house,
Yep.
a interview, something like that. That's all you can manage in this type of environment.
I'm so sorry to run.
Yep, any last questions?
I have one, but so in the end, does the $4 million make a better doctor?
Make a better what?
Doctor.
Or nurse,
From the
the
nursing.
nursing.
The early evaluation says it's good, yeah, that it's performing well.
Yeah, but I guess as a comparison, it's better than
Yeah.
the absence of the system.
Or $4 million towards more staff or play actors or, yeah, good question.
Again, early evaluation says,
Maybe
yeah,
it doesn't make a better doctor, but it makes more because it's scalable.
Because of the scalability. yeah.
no, just better in the early evaluations, like it just learning goals go, like outcomes go up compared to the way they've been.
We've got the room for another half hour. And thank you all for coming. We ask you again to just take a second and check the boxes of this thing. And thank you, David and Kevin and Ryan, for coming and sharing, and the rest of you for showing up. Any other thoughts, questions? Feel free to continue on. I just want to let people go.
I was thinking about your question too, because like if we introduce virtual reality into the classroom and bring it back to the classroom, it has that fun, fascinating factor right now, but I think a whiteboard did at one time, so did projection and,
Right.
so did a computer and all of those things. So at what point does it lose the wow factor, and then what comes next? Like, does all classroom technology have a short lifespan, and it's just given to grab some attention until they need something more?
Right, so the kind of issue I face with the technology right now and really trying to test for its academic viability with what we're doing in the libraries is one